Good evening. So the question this evening is, did Abraham exist? So there's the story of Abraham of coming from the Chaldea, city of Ur, which means the city of light in Chaldea. And there's also a story of Zoroaster having existed in a similar fashion to Abraham. And I don't know for sure, but I believe that it was Berosus who wrote about Zoroaster in the way that Josephus wrote about Abraham. Josephus mentions that there was a figure that came out of the east, an Abrahamic figure, and this he associates with the figure that Berosus was talking about, but no one's seen what Berosus was writing other than Josephus, so there's no way to verify who Berosus was talking about. And then you have, of course, the Zoroastrian figure. Now, the Zoroastrian figure doesn't really come into existence until the Persian Empire, and I don't believe anyone ever heard of Zoroaster until the Persian Empire. And if you look at when the Persian Empire it was, I believe, I don't know exactly, I'm going to say around 500 BC or 600 BC. I think that's about when it was. Maybe 400. I'm sorry, maybe it was 400. Somewhere in that range. You'll have to look it up yourself. I don't know. I can't remember exactly. But so in Zoroastrianism, which no one was practicing Zoroastrianism until around 400, 500, 600 BC, right? But the legend of Zoroaster is that he existed around 2000 BC, or maybe 1500 BC or 2000 BC. Now, it's interesting because this idea of Zoroaster seems to have appeared as far as a religion, in more recent times. Now, when were the Jews taken into captivity in Babylon? Around, what was that? Was that around 600, 500 BC? Sometime around there? I believe it was 600. But don't quote me on that. You'll have to look it up. So around the same time that the Jews were taken from Judah and held captive by the Babylonians, a little while after that, there's this new religion called Zoroastrianism. And this religion starts off about how there was this legend of this figure, and he started this new religion. And he no longer worshipped the old gods, right? But there was no record of this really before that, is what I'm suggesting. So the question is, did Zoroastrianism come from the East and then influence Judaism? That's what people thought initially, but I don't think so. Because that follows the Abrahamic theory that there was this figure and that he was the father of Zoroastrianism and then he was also the father of the Israelite religion. I don't think so. What I believe, based on what I'm looking at here, is that there was no Abraham figure. And the reason the Israelites came up with an Abraham figure was to give their religion an origin that was of their own racial origin. In other words, it came from Aram. It came from the Ur of the Chaldees, where they were from. Because understand, the story of the Noah's Ark places the landing of the Ark on Mount Ararat, which is in the Caucasus Mountains. So these are mountain people that came down into the Middle East, and they came down into Mesopotamia, and they came down into Syria, and they came down into Canaan, and they went down into Egypt, and they came out of Egypt with a new religion. So they came out of Egypt with a new religion. I have seen no evidence that this religion existed before 1000 BC. I see no evidence that it existed before 1000 BC. So now, if they're coming out of Egypt with this new religion, of course, now they're saying, well, it's always existed, and we had a guy called Abraham, and he was from where we're from, and he had it, and he actually is the one that brought it down into Egypt. So I don't believe that that's the case. So there's two theories here that I'm looking at. One is that there was an Abrahamic figure, and this religion is really old, but nobody wrote it down because I can't find any records of it. And then he ended up in Egypt, or his family ended up in Egypt, and then they came out of it and they restored the religion through Moses. That's one theory. That's the biblical narrative. The other theory is there wasn't an Abraham at all, and there wasn't a Zoroaster at all, and that Zoroaster is modeled after Abraham. And Abraham was invented by the Israelites as saying that this was something that didn't come out of Egypt, but it came out of Chaldea, where we used to come from. We used to come from this area in Aram, and this is where the religion really came from, and the patriarch of our religion really came from over there. But I don't see any record of that. I see no record of that. I do see an historical figure of an Abrahamic type character who is known as King Idirmi. Idirmi, I believe that's how it's pronounced. And he's known as the Hapiru king, and he was basically like a prince and part of a monarchy of the ancient Amorite race, who was dethroned by the new people who had taken that territory in the north called the Aryans, and at that time it was the Mitanni kingdom. The Aryans were known as the Mitanni kingdom. And he went down into Canaan and lived among the Hapiru, and he formed an army and went back up to the territory in Aram, or the territory of the Mitanni, and he overthrew that particular region with his army, his Hapiru army, and he reclaimed his throne. And he was such an amazing figure, even to the people, the empire of the Mitanni, that they recognized him as the rightful king. So it's quite an amazing story of history. And this is where you get the idea, if you've ever heard this line in the Bible, that anyone who curses Israel or curses Abraham will be cursed. Well, on his inscription on his statue, it says, anyone who curses my name or curses this statue will be cursed. So this was a common saying at the time. It was a common saying at the time. And it's on it's on an inscription of King Idirmi. I believe that's how it's pronounced. He's the closest thing I can find to Abraham, because he left his home up there in the north, and he came and lived among the Hebrews, the Hapirus. And the Hapirus were basically like Shasu tribes, shepherds. They were shepherd tribes. A lot of times they get involved in outlaw behavior, raiding, trade routes, and stealing, and and you could hire them to go attack people. You know what I mean? They were like a violent group. And he went down there, lived with these. They were like shepherds. They lived in tents, and they were also involved in kind of land piracy. That's who the Hapiru were. So he went down there and lived with the Hapiru, formed an army, and overthrew this king that had stolen his throne, and he took it back, and he was recognized by the Mitanni rulers as being the rightful king. So they let him retain his throne after that. It's a very fascinating story. The rest of his family didn't go with him. He wanted to fight, and they're like, no, this is too much. We can't do it. And they all decided that they were just going to, take some money and go live off in the sunset, and they weren't going to fight these Mitanni because these were tough guys that had come down from the north. But Idirmi did, and he reclaimed his throne by raising a Hapiru army. That's the closest thing I can find to an Abrahamic figure. But of course, this isn't the story of Abraham. It's different, but it's the closest thing I can find to an Abrahamic figure in real history. And he wasn't a monotheist or anything like that. I don't find any evidence of the monotheism that we see of the Israelites and the cult of Moses. I don't see any of that before 1000 BC in any of the records. So I'm suggesting that Abraham didn't exist. In fact, that it's a legendary figure, probably based on some other popular figure, maybe King Idirmi, maybe somebody else, because it's more of the Abrahamic version is about him fighting wars over in the territory that we now today call Jordan, which is between Israel and that kind of that land over there, which probably long ago was more fertile. Maybe the climate may have changed over time. Maybe they got more rain and there was more, I don't know. But anyway, so the other theory, and I don't know this to be a fact or not, but it's an interesting theory. which I think is probably credible because I'm trying to look at what is the truth. I'm seeking the truth, and I'm thinking there's a good chance that Abraham didn't actually exist, and that the Israelites made up Abraham as saying that this came from our people long ago, from Aram, and they came over here and they brought this religion here. But in fact, I believe from what I've seen, from what I've actually read in the historical record, is that there was no Israelite religion, anything remotely like it, really, until they came out of Egypt. And I think they got the religion from Egypt. And I think they adopted kind of this theology of a creator while in Egypt, and then they made their own. They just made for their own people, right? And so they created a backstory, and that backstory included Adam and the genealogy of Adam and the story of Noah and his sons and coming down from Aram, because there was there was a historical migration there. So that they took a real story of their migration, which came out of Ararat, because the Amorites, the word Amorite means people from the highlands. They were from the mountains. They did come down, according to at least the records that we have available. They did come down from the highlands, from the mountains, into the Middle East. So they came down into the Middle East from the mountains, and that's where they took over the territory and became the Babylonians and became these other dynasties throughout the Middle East there, after encountering the Sumerians, and they adopted a lot of the Sumerian language, the Sumerian writing, the Sumerian cuneiform script, the Sumerian gods, and some of them, like, sometimes they'll call the Sumerian gods by their names, or sometimes they'll use the Semitic or Akkadian Amorite names. So there's a mix there of those two cultures. But there's no record, as far as I can see, of anything like Abraham until after 1000 BC. So my theory, a possible theory, is that Abraham did not in fact exist, but was created as an explanation for where they came from. Because see, they're not the Egyptians, and they're somebody else, and they weren't the Egyptians. They were a race that came down from the north and came down into Egypt and had to leave Egypt because they were unhappy with the political situation there, which was becoming dangerous. And they did leave Egypt, and they started a new religion. And it was a God that was just for them, and it was monotheist in that it was just for them, and it was also closer to truth, because I believe that the Egyptians had a real secret religion that wasn't necessarily what you read about when you read about all the gods and the mythology and all this stuff. That there's two things that you have to understand. There's mythos and there's logos. So the mythology would be a story about something real or true. And so, for instance, the sun is a real thing, right? The sun is in the sky. You can see that. So that would be the sun is as a logos, or the moon is a logos. So it's an actual, real, true, existing thing. And then there'd be a mythology about it, and a story about it, and that'd be the mythological part. So what I have done in looking at religion is not dismiss everything as being false, like, oh, there's no God and there's no this. No. What is it they're describing when they're describing the God of the Israelites? Well, they're describing a God of good and evil, a God that loves justice, a God that loves righteousness, a God that loves life. And there's a lot of qualities, like if you look at the teachings of Christ also, that's what they're describing. So those are real things that they're describing and that they're mythologizing. So just like the sun was mythologized as Atum Ra, the God of the creator of the universe was mythologized in various ways, and that it was a God of justice and a God of righteousness and doing what is right, and a God of good against what is evil and wicked. And I think, that's all I really have to say about it. And I'll end up on this too. Proverbs seems to me to be a book written by someone of exceptional intelligence and reason. And it's really about, see, that's where you get into this isn't just all fake. This isn't just all a fake God and there's no real God. No, the things that are being imparted there are eternal truths. about doing right, about doing what is right, and how this is the path that you need to stay on. It's really a book written by a king, for his descendants. So when you're reading books like Proverbs and some of the other books in the Bible, you're literally reading a book that was written for kings so that they could give to their descendants and say, this is how you need to govern. This is how you're going to survive, by doing what is right, by following what is right. So this is a religion that came out of the Israelites who came out of Egypt, and I believe that some of this likely existed also among the Egyptian priest class and the Egyptian kings, because there was a managing philosophy that we don't know about and that we don't have any records of, but it did kind of survive it did. Whatever was there did survive with the Israelites who left and took that knowledge with them, is what I'm trying to say. So they took some of that knowledge with them and they applied it to their new thing, because the Egyptian religion and the Egyptian kingdom fell apart and dissolved and disappeared. But what we have left of it survived through the Israelites, is what I'm trying to say. All right, that's the end of that.